ABC Video, bringing to life a world of entertainment for everyone. A world of nature. A world of opera. A world of sport. A world of comedy. A world for children. ABC Video, a world of entertainment for everyone.
The siren went. Big Faloo has been scratched from the Melbourne Cup. Well, here's his horse been back for a squillion in doubles, you know. You could have heard a pin drop at first, and every pressman ran.
This old girl was shouting out to me, "Edgar, you look after yourself. Be careful of those Yanks," he said. "They killed Les Darcy and they poisoned Phar Lap." He said, "You be careful. You look after yourself, son."
I put too much trust in human nature. My friends are the horses.
As we say, the horse goes after the Porsche. They'll sell the Porsche before the horse. And because all they do is dream of Melbourne Cups, and Tommy Woodcock and Phar Lap have got a lot to answer for.
The glory of racing in Australia right from the earliest days was that everyone could play. In the last century particularly, it was a great unifying force, and the horse in Australian culture has got a place it hasn't got in England or America, or I'd suggest anywhere else in the world.
For 2 centuries, they've been one of our great obsessions. Half-ton animals urged to run at reckless speed. On legs that seem too fine, they've carried our desperate hopes and our dreams of glory. They've made of us more losers than winners, criminals, cheats and liars, heroes and saints. It has been a race between good breeding and bad behaviour, and it's still bloody hard to pick the winner. Port Jackson on that January day in 1788, 1 stallion, 4 mares, a colt, a filly, and 736 convicts were put ashore from the First Fleet. We can assume the horses were better treated than the human cargo. And whatever the hopes for this strange dumping ground of Mother England's excess prisoners, it would have all come to little without the horse.
Come on.
If the white man was ever going to move far from the Sydney sands, let alone make a nation, the horse would be vital. Bizarre as the kangaroo seemed to the European, to the Aboriginal people the horse must have looked at least as strange. For the 1500 Eora tribe who lived in Sydney, there must have come a time when they realised that this was an invasion, and that the horse would be one of the principal weapons. In the violence and confusion, some Aborigines believed that horse and rider were one, that the bullets came from their nostrils. "18 months after those first horses came ashore, a second fleet straggled into a colony close to starvation. 1 in 4 had not survived the voyage. Among the new arrivals was a man who would leave his mark on Australian racing. Darcy Wentworth arrived as a free man, but he could so easily have come as a convict.
Darcy had a pretty disreputable background because he lived very high in London, I think, at a pace he couldn't afford. But the less said about his London life, the better, I think.
You know, he was a highwayman. He was out there 3 times he's tried, 3 times he's found not guilty in England. The 4th time the family is somewhat worried. They don't know if they can handle it. And so his kinsman write to the Colonial Secretary asking if Darcy can be allowed to become a surgeon in New South Wales.
He also traded rum and acquired large tracts of land. There is even a dubious suggestion that the ex-highwayman displayed his horsemanship in the match races that were our first contests of horse and rider. Riding and wagering on these 2-horse duels were one of the few diversions from the grind of early colonial life.
One of the things that really comes through it is this sense of bonhomie, of good humour, of fun, and a sense of, I suppose, high testosterone. I mean, it's often important to remember that this is a society predominantly of young males looking for an opportunity to do something daring and wicked and outrageous.
It wasn't until the late 1790s that the first thoroughbred arrived from South Africa. The nearly fatal voyage was recorded by a young naval officer.
A very heavy sea broke on board the ship astern and broke the ship. This was followed by several others which forced the cabin windows in and broke or removed everything in the cabin, leaving the water for some time above my knees.
The sea breaking over the ship with shocks that are inconceivable, a few more of which, I'm well convinced, must have sent it to the bottom.
The sailor who wrote that letter is claimed as the first Australian forebear of the most famous bookmaking dynasty in the story of our track. His name was Henry Waterhouse.
We were fortunate enough to land 39 head of black cattle, 3 mares, a colt, and nearly 2/3 of the sheep.
The colt was Rockingham, known also as Young Rockingham, the bearer of an English bloodline. He arrived in a colony where good breeding was a rare commodity. Escaping convicts, looting and disease, trade conducted in the currency of rum, and finally a rebellion against the governor, forced the London Colonial Office to send us a professional soldier. The son of a Scottish lord, Major General Lachlan Macquarie.
I found the colony barely emerging from infantile imbecility, suffering from various privations and disabilities. The population in general depressed by poverty. No public credit, no private confidence. The morals of the great mass of the population in the lowest state of debasement.
Macquarie, he had that stoic, ordered, disciplined character, and he immediately decided that instead of having a degenerate colonial outpost of the empire, he was going to make this into a place worthy of both the British Empire and also his own governorship.
Whether we liked it or not, the governor would civilise us. He straightened and renamed the streets, built a hospital, church and new barracks. The grog shanties and gaming dens were closed down. And in our recreation, he would show us the English gentleman's example of the sport of kings.
When Macquarie came here, his concept of a race meeting would be part of the cultural life of the well-to-do and the respectable and the gentry class of England. And that's what he thought if he did one here, it would give to this colony, this town, the sense that it did have a higher level of life and entertainment and social world for the colony.
It would be as much social as sporting, the biggest event in our short history. However, as for letting our hair down, Macquarie had his suspicions about these colonials and ex-convicts.
It's being highly necessary that peace and good order should be preserved at the ensuing races. I strictly forbid and prohibit all species of gaming, drunkenness, swearing, quarrelling, fighting, or boxing taking place on or near the race ground.
On what is now central Sydney's Hyde Park, the soldiers of the 73rd Highland Regiment hewed a rough racecourse. Darcy Wentworth and his son William Charles would be prominent players in that 1810 meeting. Billy Wentworth is the great-great-grandson of Darcy.
Well, Hyde Park is a bit to the south of where the main Sydney town was, so it was more or less in the bush in those days. It was the level stretch of land, so it naturally became the first racecourse.
The starters lined up at the northeast end of Hyde Park, near College Street. 19-year-old William Wentworth was Darcy's illegitimate son, his mother a convict. His background would impact on both his character and his long relationship with racing. On the first day, William rode his father's prized horse, Gig, against a horse called Jerry. It was a tough 3-mile race. And despite Macquarie's ban on gambling, Darcy wagered 110 guineas on Gig. And finally, William rode to victory, past the finishing post where St James Station now stands. Then as now, the prohibition on public drunkenness was also totally ignored. The biggest booze-up the colony had seen raged through the night.
They were pretty riotous days in those days. The boys got up to a bit of rum and so on. as you would expect, and as is right and proper with a race course.
There were early moralists in Sydney who were very quick to point out that horse racing was going to lead to all sorts of other sins and wickednesses and debauchery and so on. And I think there was one character in early Sydney who was even talking about unwanted pregnancies as a result of horse racing, which is a kind of a long bow to draw, but I guess we can see his point.
For 4 years, officially sanctioned racing continued in Hyde Park, but it seemed it was not the civilising activity Macquarie had hoped for. In a letter to his police chief, the former highwayman Darcy Wentworth, he expressed his disappointment in Australian racing.
Serious affrays having taken place between the soldiers and inhabitants, and to such a violent degree, the troops have been confined within the barracks in order to prevent mischief. I cannot on any account allow or sanction any more races or meetings of this kind to take place at present after this day.
But it was horses and William Wentworth that made the future of white Australia. In 1813, with Gregory Blaxland and William Lawson, he crossed the Great Barrier of the Blue Mountains. The first wave in the seizure and settlement now broke on millions of inland acres. Reaching for his place in history, Wentworth, a better horseman than poet, later memorialised the expedition in epic verse.
Till gained with toilsome step thy topmost heath, we spied the cheering smokes ascend beneath. Hail, mighty ridge, that from thy azure brow survey'st these fertile plains that stretch below.
Well, William Wentworth is regarded as one of the first people who had an Australian sensibility. He wanted Australians to look after Australian affairs, and you see he's an explorer. He's a person who's prepared to take lots of risks.
In 1825, William Wentworth, by then living in the harbourside mansion of Vaucluse House, was one of the moving forces in the formation of the Sydney Turf Club. Although the club's membership fees made it a gentleman's organisation, lesser mortals were allowed to race their horses at its meetings.
Wentworth saw racing as really important for the emerging country. It was part of this whole liberal thing, that people could all take part in this organised game, sport, whatever. It would not be just for the elites.
Like the men who have tended to run racing ever since, Wentworth was rich and influential. But for the time being at least, perhaps it was a legacy of his breeding, wealth hadn't blunted his sense of justice.
As a native-born Australian, as the son of a convict woman, he discovered his father had been tried for highway robbery. All those things convinced him that as an underdog he had to destroy the ruling elites. And so he set about forming a party, if you like, in inverted commas, between convicts, emancipists and the new migrants against the elites.
Such views were seen as dangerously radical by an Englishman who arrived as the new governor in 1825. General Sir Ralph Darling was an officious snob. One of his first decisions was to bar anyone of convict stock from all government jobs. Wentworth declared war.
He entered that wild radical phase in which he attacked the governor. He edited the Australian newspaper. He demanded that the convicts be given proper treatment and rights. And when one of the convicts died in prison, a man called Suds, he impeached the governor, who was Governor Darling at this stage, impeached him before the House of Commons as a murderer. Now this was wild stuff.
Put General Darling to the bar of British justice, and I will make out to the satisfaction of the universe such a series of fraud, tyranny and corruption as I trust have never occurred before in the history of our colonial government.
My lord, Mr. Wentworth is in the habit of indulging in the most indecent invectives against the governor and the measure of the government. He is a demagogue, a vulgar, ill-bred fellow, utterly unconscious of the common civilities due from one gentleman to another. In short, he is anxious to become the man of the people, and seems to think the best means of accomplishing this is by insulting the government.
The bitter dispute spilt onto the track. The new governor's predecessor, Sir Thomas Brisbane, had not only donated a silver cup to the STC, but was its patron and friend. Darling refused to be either, and when he declined an invitation to a turf club dinner, his absence was duly noted.
Sir Thomas Brisbane was the man who mixed among the people. His race cup will be preserved as a grateful memento of the worthy giver. The health of Sir Thomas Brisbane. But we must also toast Governor Ralph Darling.
The selection of the tune, Over the Hills and Far Away, was taken as the insult that had been intended.
My lord, I am induced to bring under your lordship's notice the late proceedings of the Turf Club. I was invited, but declined attending, being extremely unwell and having long since determined not to mix in such associations. There are some observations respecting the tune which was played when my health was drank, there being no doubt upon the intentions of Mr. Wentworth as to follow up the course of public insult.
The vengeful Darling now gave his patronage to the newly formed Australian Racing and Jockey Club. He threatened to sack any public official who remained a member of the STC, and made good his threat against a recalcitrant Crown Solicitor.
This is part of that conflict between emancipists and exclusives. It's really part of currency versus sterling. Those who support Britain, who see Britain as the dominating influence, are going to go and join the AJC. Those who have patronage from the governor will join the AJC. Those of the native-born, the emancipists, the new migrants are going to join with Wentworth in what he argues is the Australian sort of way forward.
For many white Australians, the way forward was inland, out onto the rich acres beyond the Blue Mountains. And God help anyone who stood in the way of their right to build their homes among the gum trees or seize the country where their sheep might safely graze. In the taming of the land and the original landholders, the horse was both working animal and weapon.
What gave Europeans the great advantage was their speed and mobility with horses, and this is seen in the differences in the frontier conflict. In New South Wales, by and large, frontiersmen had horses because the distances were so great, and therefore they had great advantage over the Aborigines.
Despite the fact that the horse would be used to hunt and kill Aborigines well into the 20th century, most early images are of a different prey. By 1828, there were 12,500 horses in the colony, one for every 3 white people.
Australia's history really rides on the horse's back because the horse was the essential thread linking the community together. As the colony developed, particularly after mountains were crossed, and it became a frontier society with sheep and wheat and farming and gold later on, the only ways these separate and small scattered communities could keep in touch with one another was by horse transport or by communication by the horse.
As early as 1822, the spread of racing was exciting letter writers to the Sydney Gazette. There was too much racing in the Hawkesbury, some claimed, giving rise to drunkenness and immorality. But they were voices in the wilderness.
Racing very quickly became a focal point as each new area was settled. Racing provided an opportunity for the people of those areas to find an excuse to get together on occasions. So usually the racecourse, along with the church, the school and the pub, were the first things to appear in each country town as they developed.
Among those who followed the horse, establishing new bush communities, were now large numbers of Irish. Especially savaged by British justice, 50,000 of them had been transported here. Predominantly poor and Catholic, they were to remain subject to English and Protestant prejudice. But there were some fresh freedoms and opportunities in the new country.
They came here with nothing, only one place to go, and that's up. I remember an uncle who was a vivid example of this. He was a publican, telling me, son, there's only really two ways that our crowd could ever get ahead. That was on the punt and through grog, becoming publicans. No property to speak of. Most of them barely educated out of primary school, if that. You know, we were the tykes, the first ethnics.
The Irish came from a rural background, so they knew land, they knew horses, they knew riding, and so given their social skills of talk and the place of gambling in the liturgy of the Catholic Church, which was pretty much the reverse of what it is on the evangelical Protestant hierarchy of sins, the racecourse attracted them. From the very beginning, the Irish became a very special auxiliary to Australian racing.
In fact, for everyone, early Australian racing was increasingly a kind of social conflict resolution. A ritual act of horseback equality was recorded in the New South Wales bush community of Wallabada. The English owner of a horse called Traveller claimed nothing good was in the colonies. A 17-year-old stock rider, John Mulharvey, and his horse, Spider, rose to the challenge.
Past the post the first time round, there was only a neck difference. Traveller leading. Then Mulharvey, shooting to the front, came away with the lead, finishing a splendid race. 3 cheers for Spider's jockey Mulharvey by the crowd. This proves there are good horsemen in Australia, as well as England.
Having put his money where his mouth was, the Englishman lost £50.
Sport was a way that you showed that you were as good as other people. So currency, that is, the colonists could show they were as good as sterling by beating them at sport. It would show the convict taint hadn't spread through in any sort of genetic way. It would show that, for example, the sun had not bleached your brains, as some people thought it would, in the southern seas.
Formal racing had begun in Van Diemen's Land only 3 years after Sydney. There, as the Reverend Bobby Knopwood sadly recorded, the 1815 St Patrick's Day meeting was cancelled on account so many bushrangers being in the woods. On another St Patrick's Day in 1848, the Longford course near Launceston was opened, and they've been racing there continuously ever since. Across the continent in Perth in the early 1830s, ponies imported from Timor were raced on the sands of East Beach. The first thoroughbreds came to the west in 1836. A year earlier, the syphilitic John Batman made a disputed purchase of the 600,000 acres around what was to become Melbourne. In exchange, he gave the Kulin people scissors, axes, blankets, and a few beads. From the first, and despite the character of its founding father, Melbourne craved respectability.
The civilization of Port Phillip should be quite different from that broken, cold, and unnatural form of society which had sprung up in New South Wales. Ours should encourage the better and more kindly feelings of men's natures.
For all their fine intentions, Melbourne's first race meeting, run in 1838 on the roughest of courses around Batman's Hill, was as debauched as anything in Sydney. It was run by a publican, John Pascoe Faulkner, who claimed he, not Batman, was Melbourne's true founder. His on-course grog shop was drunk dry by the racegoers, and a woman fell into the Yarra and drowned. It was inevitable that the Southerners' sense of moral and social superiority would have to be demonstrated on the racetrack. Their champion horse of the 1840s, Petrel, would show New South Wales what good breeding was all about. Petrel's mother was probably stolen, and her foal left on a farm by the itinerant horse thief. A man called Gubb bought him for his wife to ride. Petrel seemed destined for a life as a mere farm hack.
When only 2 years old, he was ridden as a hack by Mrs. Gubb, a lady who turned the scales at 14 stone. His merits were first discovered owing to a disagreement between Mr. and Mrs. Gubb as to the proprietorship of a bottle of rum.
Oh, give it here.
Mrs. Gubb defied him to catch her, and a race ensued in which the fair 14 stone one distanced her lord and master.
Petrel's initial glory came in the Melbourne Town Plate. It was run over 3 two-mile heats with only an hour's break between each, and Petrel won them all. Melbourne duly declared him the country's best horse. His northern opponent would be Jorrocks, a part Arab foaled in 1833. His breeder, the story goes, traded him for 8 heifers. He began his working life as a stock horse, but his great-grandmother had been sired by that first Australian thoroughbred, Rockingham. Jorrocks is the first hero horse in Australian racing. He won some 60 of his 113 starts. As well as starring in Sydney, the Iron Gelding walked the country circuit to race in Bathurst and Goulburn, Maitland and Mudgee. For many a bush racegoer, Jorrocks was one of the shared pleasures of their isolated lives.
Jorrocks was a terribly tough horse. So was Petrel. They were all tough horses in those days. And they just raced them in a way we wouldn't think of these days, day after day and sometimes twice in a day, this sort of thing. But it was another world, very hard world, very hard on horses.
The 1849 clash between Petrel and Jorrocks to decide which was the best horse in Australia was a triumph for Sydney, something less for Melbourne. The voyage north had been a rough one, and Petrel was beaten badly in the first heat. The crowing of the Sydney press deepened the mutual loathing between the cities, ensuring that all future intercolonial races were matters of intense public interest. A subsequent match-up between the Victorian champion, Alice Hawthorn, and Sydney's Vino brought a crowd estimated at 18,000 to Flemington. In a country that would be unable to agree on even a common railway gauge, the parochial passion for horse racing and its local heroes had paradoxically begun to unify us.
The intercolonial contests that began particularly in the 1840s and 50s had a very important role to play in making people realise that they were Australians. So some of the earliest races that had that were called things like the Australasian Championship or the Australasian Champion Sweepstakes, and this sense that it was actually possible to bring together colonists from the different Australian colonies, I think it was really quite important in developing the national consciousness.
Yet for all racing promised in the making of a single nation, it would not anytime soon include women. Of course, they were free to dress up, pretty their little heads and add some colour to the drab maleness of the race day crowd. And if they must have a bet, as ladies, they were discouraged from wagering anything more than their gloves. In Adelaide, there was much derision of the news that a field of women jockeys would contest a maiden race.
There were various rumours respecting their names and pedigrees. The attention of the spectators was diverted from the race by a warm dispute, originating in an attempt having been made to run the horse Hippie, with a rider known to the police as a girl of disreputable character. This the stewards, very properly, disallowed.
One of the few women to own and train horses in New South Wales in the 19th century was Mary Wentworth Dixon.
She got up the nose of many of the men, and she annoyed them because she refused to accept the rules and the regulations. They used all sorts of dirty tricks to keep her out of the business, and she took it all very stoically.
Wentworth Dixon trained at Randwick in the 1860s. When her male tormentors illegally sold some of her horses, she stole them back at training one morning, hid them, and is said to have whitewashed one horse to change its colour.
Eventually, when the police arrived, because they got a tip-off as to where these horses were being hidden, the constable in charge apparently had a little bit of difficulty, and he said that Miss Dixon and her mother had put up a degree of force, and that he had to use more force than was his custom with women. So she, in turn, I think it was the mother who slapped the policeman. One of them pulled his whiskers. Under the circumstances, I think they got off pretty lightly. But unfortunately for posterity, Mary Wentworth Dixon kind of retired from the racing scene at that stage. But she was a goer.
Indeed, by then we had become a country of goers. Goers after gold. Its 1851 discovery, first near Bathurst in New South Wales, and then in a rush that would ultimately encircle the continent, rewrote our future. It was a madness. The vast majority of the many thousands who gave up everything for the promise of sudden wealth found nothing. But it made Australia a place of substance, and perhaps inflicted on us a national characteristic. As a people, the gold rushes seemed to leave us genetically modified, eternally encoded as gamblers.
What you could say, in a way, was Australia was born out of hope. People who came out here for the gold, hoping that they weren't rich in England or Germany or wherever, but they'd get rich in Australia. People who took up land in Australia, some of it pretty awful land by European standards, but they had this great hope it'd make them rich. And you know, all of Australia in a way was one hell of a gamble, particularly against nature. And it fits in with that people like to bet on horses.
Gold also brought out the bushrangers for their final fling as our great anti-heroes. In the highwayman spirit of Darcy Wentworth, they held up the gold escorts. And on their days off, they too would go to the races to check out the form of the thoroughbreds so they'd know which ones to steal.
Your bushranger, you need a good horse. I guess you wouldn't rob a bank with an old combi van, would you? I mean, you want a fast car. Well, you need a fast horse if you're a bushranger. Ned Kelly had a very close affinity with horses. He's thought to be a pretty good rider. but he used to move a few. Ben Hall knew where the good ones were and used to pick them out, and it was a big thing in those days.
Hall is said to have been so fond of a racehorse called Troubadour, he stole it 9 times. There is even a dubious legend that when Hall was ambushed and shot to pieces near Forbes in 1865, they also killed his horse. Frederick Ward, better known as Captain Thunderbolt, had started out as a jockey but found bushranging more lucrative. As an outlaw, he often hid out in the New South Wales Widden Valley. The rugged sandstone cliffs offered excellent refuge, and the stud farm in the valley, still there today, ensured a supply of good horses.
He never stole. He liked to borrow a horse. He had to do a lot of miles in those days and stay on the run, and if he had a horse that went lame or wasn't up to it, they'd find one of their good colts or nice young race fillies missing from the paddock, and in its place was his lame horse. And a few weeks later, when his horse wasn't as lame, our horse would be back and his would be gone.
And the man responsible for the largely incompetent pursuit of Ned Kelly is generally credited with suggesting our greatest racing institution. Captain Freddie Standish, race club committee man and chief of police, is said to have first proposed the Melbourne Cup.
There's a lot of people coming to Melbourne who've got a lot of money, and many of them have never had money before. And suddenly there's this gearing up of let's do things that are a little bit more ambitious. Let's have a really big prize money for a particular horse race.
At the time it was thought to be pretty stupid, because the European idea, then as now, was your top races are weight for age. The Melbourne Cup was organised as a handicap, and one of the early turf riders said, it's a stupid idea, doomed to failure. I mean, you can put a Brumby in it and go round. What it was that made the Cup so popular was the essential democracy in it. It's a very Australian sort of race.
And so the Victorian Turf Club announced the running of the Melbourne Cup, an egalitarian affair in which the best horses were weighted down to make the race more equal. The trophy was not a cup, but a gold watch. The purse of £710, the highest in the land. It was held at Flemington on the first Thursday in November 1861. There were 4,000 in the crowd. A local horse, Mormon, was hot favourite, but the bookies were wary of a New South Wales stayer called Archer. A shocking fall brought down 3 horses, killing 2 and breaking a jockey's arm. But the field raced on. At the home turn, Mormon made his run to the delight of the local crowd. But Archer, the northern invader, ran down the favourite.
The settling was the worst the books could remember, and it will be a long time before the ring recovers itself from the severe blow which the victory of Archer in the Cup administered.
The fact that Archer came down to Melbourne, won 2 Melbourne Cups, took a lot of money away from Melbourne, really gave Sydney a taste for the Melbourne Cup, and I feel that if a Melbourne horse had won it, it probably wouldn't have had anything like the same kind of appeal in other colonies. So this notion that you can send your horse to another colony and clean up, it's great for public relations.
Archer's entry in the 3rd Melbourne Cup was not accepted. His nomination, the officials said, was too late. All entrants from the other colonies withdrew in protest. With only 7 local horses, it was the smallest field in the Cup's history. Archer's trainer, Etienne de Maistre, vowed never to return. But de Maistre was destined for great things.
He had 11 children. 1 died in infancy. But that didn't worry Etienne. Etienne didn't worry about the children. None of them were educated. They all had to make their own way in life. And that's probably why he was good and so successful, because he concentrated absolutely on his horses and the training of his horses.
De Maistre would go on to win 5 Melbourne Cups, an achievement only surpassed a century later by Bart Cummings. And such are the passions in racing that there is still a family dispute about De Maistre's association with Archer.
Archer by William Tell, Maid of the Oaks, the Dam. De Maistre's never owned Archer. De Maistre rented Archer from the Royds estate, took him to Narara and trained him and raced, nominated him and raced him, but he did not own him.
It is entered in these races as owned and trained by Etienne de Maistre, and I wouldn't dispute that.
But John Royds says Archer was buried in Braidwood on a family property. It's his first time back there in 50 years.
I'll get up on the top of this, survey the countryside from the hill here. If you ever want to know where Archer was buried, you dig down there and you'll find him. Down there on that creek, about 2/3 from the creek, that was Archer's grave. It could have been anywhere along here, just along here somewhere.
However, the really contentious issue about Archer is the legend, accepted by most Australians as a kind of racing commandment, that the horse walked from New South Wales to Melbourne and back again twice.
J. Cutts, the jockey, was given Archer and he walked him from Nowra through the hills via Cooma and turned up in Melbourne and raced and won the cup and then walked him home. And I've been told that ever since I was knee-high to a goose.
There are direct reports of, in effect, we saw Archer going onto the ship in Sydney, we saw him getting off the ship at Melbourne, therefore he went by sea. Well, I thought perhaps he'd walked the next year because he came back in 1862. Unfortunately, the newspapers tell us exactly the same story. Archer comes by ship, we know the name of the ship, we know when it left Sydney, we know when it went to Melbourne. Eyewitnesses seeing him getting on and off at both ends, we know that he went back to Sydney by ship.
Why the heck would they win a Melbourne Cup and risk it to a blinking rocking damn little piddling ship? They think those things.
When thousands of white stockmen walked off the land to join the gold rush, the boss cockies had been forced to replace them with Aborigines. Many of them became legendary riders. On the track, it was a young Aboriginal strapper, Peter St Albans, who first rode into racing history. His father was possibly James Wilson, the owner of St Albans Stud in Geelong, and a crafty man, even by horse trainers' standards. His Aboriginal mother worked for Wilson. Behind the walls, he trained a promising filly called Brecius, planning to run her as a smoky in the 1875 Doncaster in Sydney.
Smoky is a word for getting a horse into a race without its credentials being known by the punters or the bookmakers. Now, Brecius was, I suppose, one of the most outstanding racehorses in Australian history, but before James Wilson planned his smoky, Brecius hadn't won a race.
For its first race, the unknown Brecius got a weight of just 5 stone, 10 pounds. The regular jockey was far too heavy to ride her, and Wilson's smokescreen got even heavier.
So he brought with him a little 13-year-old boy called Peter St Albans. An unknown jockey to everybody here just came through the field, cleaned up and won by a length, won the Doncaster, one of the major miles.
Wilson made a killing. Although he would not be able to hide her form again, he set Brecius for the big one. With skill and courage, Peter St Albans, at the age of 13, rode Brecius to victory in the 1876 Melbourne Cup. Yet in all the reports of that remarkable win, no one mentioned he was an Aborigine.
When the results came through, according to the Sydney Mail, in the streets of Sydney the cry went up, "Hurrah for the filly and little St Albans."
It seemed only as exotic novelties could we accept Aborigines on the city tracks. As white society's national pastime, racing was unrecognisable from the hopeful but rough institution William Wentworth had fought over. Dead and buried in our first state funeral, even he might have been amazed by the 1880 Melbourne Cup. It brought 100,000 people to Flemington, a third of the city's population.
The Melbourne Cup is the Australian National Day. It would be difficult to overstate its importance. It overshadows all other holidays. Overshadows them. I might almost say it blots them out. Cup Day is supreme. It has no rival.
In those days, you'd have to say most people had some connection with the horse. The horse was everything. And therefore, the horse, if you like, had a place of honour that it hasn't got these days. And if you wanted to see the best, you went to Flemington on Cup Day.
And the best that ever raced in Australia now made his entrance. Perhaps because Carbine, like so many of the great Australian horses, was born and raised in New Zealand, he transcended the bitter intercolonial rivalries. His breeder was so obsessed with improving the bloodline, he shot his failures. Carbine was spared the bullet, but he was far from perfect.
Carbine's a good example, just what a lottery racing is. Because if you look at him now, he's got quite serious faults in conformation. You wouldn't buy a horse that looked like him now because you'd say it couldn't gallop. And yet he may have been the best of them all.
He was a bay stallion with a gentle character, but his front legs were considered far too straight for a good galloper. He also suffered from a chronic split heel. In the 1890 Cumberland Stakes, Carbine was left an unlikely last when he stumbled and nearly fell at the half mile. He steadied, settled, and got up to win by a head. They could hear the cheering a mile from Randwick.
Carbine won over all distances from 6 furlongs to 3 miles. He won 4 races in a week. He ran on wet tracks, dry tracks, drought-stricken tracks. Everything about him has got that touch of tremendous excitement, heroic proportions, unexpected results. He's just a legendary horse.
The 1890 Melbourne Cup saw an all-time record 39 starters. Carbine, with that split heel and the most savage weight carried by any cup winner before or since, 10 stone 5 pounds, about 66 kilos, refused at first to go onto the track. And when the field finally came for home, highborn, full of running and carrying nearly 4 stone less than Carbine, hit the front. But as he almost always did, old Jack ran him down.
It was just one of those magic moments, and the descriptions of Flemington on Cup Day when Carbine won are wonderful. The sort of notions of hats being thrown into the air and women fainting and men screaming and children being trampled underfoot, and people desperate to try and grab a hair of poor old Carbine's tail, a sense that somehow history had really been made, and I think it was the high point of 19th century Australian racing.
He just had that character about him that Australians at that stage were looking for, perhaps some national symbol. There was this sense that we did have a national identity, that we were a country in which we recognised our own way of life and society, that Queen Victoria was a distant monarch whose portrait was hung up in all the halls around the place, but Carbine was an Australian racehorse who we all knew about and could identify with for his great deeds. Perhaps more Australians knew about Carbine than they did about Edward Barton, who was the first Prime Minister.
In a single lifetime, from match race to Melbourne Cup, the track had become, for many of us, as important as either church or state. Through the simple conflict of horse and rider, the tribal hatreds resolved in racing, it had given us a shared experience and a unity that the politicians were struggling for in the making of a nation. But racing, and how we gambled on it, was about to become the issue in a hard and holy war. For some of its combatants, it would be a fight to the finish. On an April Saturday in 1895, the greatest racehorse Australians had known sailed from the waters of Port Phillip Bay, never to return. Carbine was bound for England, his owner forced to sell him by savage economic depression. On the wharf there were tears and a brass band played. But in blood, myth and money, the legacy of the New Zealand-born Bay was already at work in Australian racing. Carbine had won for a syndicate of Japanese pearl fishers on Thursday Island in the Torres Strait £22,500. They'd held the winning ticket in a George Adams Tattersalls sweepstake. A 19-year-old in a Collingwood boot factory also won on Carbine. John Wren would parlay those winnings into an empire as he became the central figure in the brutal battles for the hearts and money of the Australian gambler. While racing in the time of Federation and the Great War would be a force for national unity, how we bet on those horses would be an entirely different matter. The place of horse racing in our history was sealed in 1896 when agents for the Lumiere brothers chose the track as the location for the first moving images of Australians. The earliest surviving motion pictures in which we see ourselves are therefore, and perhaps rightly, from Flemington on Melbourne Cup Day. As we bicket our way towards Federation and its wobbly nationhood, horse racing was, inarguably, our most popular, most national diversion. Sport and theatre, commerce, romance and symbol.
I mean, at Easter in our home, good Irish Catholic home, Good Friday came, and on crucifixion on Good Friday, the resurrection on Easter Sunday, the Doncaster handicap on Saturday and the Sydney Cup on Monday. And that mixture was part of the world that I grew up with.
The Kalgoorlie round was like Christmas time to them. They'd save all their money up till Christmas, till the August round, and go to the races. And the women, they'd be better dressed than what they would on the Flemington racecourse. And why they dressed so well, I don't know, but a dust storm would come and they'd be, all be covered in red dust. And their beautiful dresses, and they'd be nearly ruined. But everyone used to dress up for the Kalgoorlie and Boulder Cup.
Before the North Pole was discovered, some cynics said it would be discovered easily enough by advertising a race meeting there, when a couple of dozen Australians would infallibly turn up with their horses.
Our only true national poet, Andrew Barton Patterson, the banjo, would have likely joined that Arctic race meeting. Racing, especially the bush variety, was his enduring passion.
Thousands and thousands and thousands more. Like sand on the white Pacific shore, the crowding people cluster. Forevermore it's the story old, while races are bought and backers sold, drawn by the greed of the gain of gold. In their thousands still they muster.
Banjo's greed of the gain of gold had, among other things, given Australian bookmakers their unique theatricality. Before the 1880s, the bookies' trade was a furtive one. And then sometime English actor Robert Standish Sevier changed everything. Instead of scuttling among the crowd, Sevier chose his spot, stood his ground, and shouted the odds, drawing the punters to him.
He created a sensation because it had never been done before. Made a lot of money, came to Sydney, and bookmaking as we know it today was born.
And they were called the leather-lunged purveyors of the odds, and you've got these stentorian voices, that's what they called them, and the Leviathan bookmakers, and the betting ring at the racecourses were loud, noisy, raucous affairs once they all got going.
They became, along with the coal miners, the wealthiest class in Australia. They had money to burn. The girls, they went out, they put diamonds in the heels of their shoes. It was a very fashionable thing, and to be a bookmaker, to be a successful bookmaker, was the licence really to print money.
In a country ridden with anti-Semitism, the cleverest bookmaker at the turn of the century was a Cockney Jew. Sol Green, the Leviathan, had arrived as a 17-year-old at the port of Williamstown with the proverbial sixpence in his pocket.
Sol Green was arguably the biggest bookmaker ever in Melbourne. He drove a green Rolls-Royce, appropriate colour, and he was a bookmaker during the golden years of bookmaking, when crowds were 20 deep around Sol Green's stand at Flemington.
Humphrey Oxenham was just as formidable, but a man for whom bookmaking was more circus than science.
Humphrey Oxenham was Sydney's biggest and most flamboyant bookie of the era. He was the man who, when he was 18 years old, had been involved in a legendary bet. He was a labourer in the Bathurst district, and a local publican had bet him £200 to sixpence, odds of 8,000 to 1, that Oxenham couldn't walk 2 miles with a pumpkin on his head in a certain time without touching it.
He walked the 2 miles and he carried this pumpkin, and with that bank he began what was to be one of the most, one of the great careers in gambling in Australia. Loved by most people, I think. He just looked like a great big fat bookmaker.
But the man who gambling made richer than anyone, the most successful racing identity in the story of the Australian track, was George Adams. For Adams had the only betting system that could never lose. He arrived here from England with his parents in the gold rush years. Failing to find his fortune in those madding, overcrowded fields, he seemed to settle for small-town life. But then in 1878, he took over the Sydney racing man's hotel, Tattersalls, in Pitt Street. He began running private sweepstakes for his regulars on major races. His decision to go public with a sweep on the 1881 Sydney Cup was to change many fortunes.
He cottoned on to the idea that you didn't absolutely have to be crooked to make a lot of money out of gambling. Now, a few other people have followed up those ideas. It's now embedded, as it were, nationally into things like the TAB. It basically means that if you can get the turnover, you can make a lot of money, and that was George Adams' secret.
And before long, he was attracting enormous amounts of interest. He was running sweepstakes that were bringing in up to £200,000.
Sydney still retains an echo of the Adams fortune in the marble bar that sits reassembled below the Hilton Hotel. As the rest of the country staggered into the deep economic depression of the 1890s, such conspicuous flaunting of a wealth built on the evil of gambling brought the hounds of heaven baying for the blood of George Adams.
Wowsers were essentially Protestant, and a wowser has been well defined as a man who is appalled by the fact that somebody somewhere may be enjoying himself.
Wowserism, that particularly Australian word for the self-righteous battle against sinful pleasure, was, late in the 19th century, in its days of glory. Along with booze, mixed bathing and inflamed passions, the Wowsers hated gambling.
There was a fear that somehow racing and gambling was permeating society, that the laws were not operating, they're not effective, and it basically meant that they felt that things were getting out of control. There was a crisis happening there.
Who has not seen the ruined home, the heartbroken wife, the ragged children whose condition is due to gambling by the head of the house?
Working class attitudes have tended much more to reflect living for the day. That if a person was able to save a little bit of their income, it would be so little that it made no real difference in the long term. That they might be far better off risking that little bit of disposable income in hope of a significant, life-changing result through gambling.
Then as now, the anti-gambling lobby had a point. Our national addiction to the punt is still for many a life-destroying madness. Yet in their crusading vehemence, the Christians themselves verged on insanity.
A gambler, as gambler, has no rights except the rights of vermin, or rather, the right of vermin, for it has only one, and that is the right to quick extinction.
It is all contained in a small parody of a famous hymn. We are the sweet selected few, the rest of you are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We can't have heaven crammed.
In their determined campaign for a heaven and earth uncluttered by sinners, they had their victories. The Wowsers were such a powerful force in Australian affairs that there were times when it seemed their triumph over gambling would be total. In 1893, they forced the government of New South Wales to outlaw sweepstakes. The satanic George Adams was cast out, first to Queensland.
He played a role as a kind of stage manager of trying to get the Queensland clubs to put a bit more money into their races, to beef them up, to make them a bit more interesting, and they would become then the subject of sweepstakes.
Adams' battle with the Brisbane Wowsers wasn't helped by the scandal surrounding his sweep on the 1895 Queensland Cup. The trainer of the favourite, Trance, approached the holder of his horse's sweep ticket, demanding a share of any winnings. The ticket holder told the trainer to bugger off. Trance, with the trainer's brother in the saddle, was then inexplicably ridden first into the ground and then off the track. But even as he was being run out of Queensland, Adams had negotiated his Van Diemen's Land bolt hole. With a breathtaking double standard, the Tasmanian government decided the desperate economy needed the money, and to hell with the morality. When the Premier demanded a good faith bond of £10,000 for licensing tats, Adams took out his wallet and counted out the cash.
There were periods in Tasmania's 20th century history when the income from George Adams' sweepstakes provided up to 50% of the state revenue. So he effectively reduced taxation for the people of Tasmania for the best part of 50 years.
The new Commonwealth even tried to kill off his Tasmanian business by banning the delivery of any sweepstake-related mail. It didn't work. In 1 week, Tattersalls in Hobart received 6,000 letters, of which only 47 were from Tasmania.
They might put signs out in front of the newsagents which simply said something like, I have an aunt in Tasmania, or friends in Tasmania looking forward to correspondence, or some other codes or signs which would make it very clear to the average person that these people were acting as agents for Tattersall's sweepstakes.
George Adams died of a stroke in 1904. He was an honest and a generous man. He may even have got to heaven ahead of some of his holy hunters, and God knows there were some real villains in early 20th century racing. Grafter James Kingsley, for one.
Kingsley's most famous scam occurred in the Newcastle area of New South Wales in 1903. He had two horses, Gentleman Jim and Harvest Home, that had won a series of races under increasing weights, and the bookies would keep betting against them because each time they won they would get a bigger weight in the next race, and they couldn't understand how these horses just kept winning.
What Grafter did was to have a hole drilled in the floor of the weighing room under the scales. Somehow he got in there and got a hole drilled by a racing bit, and then underneath that he hung a wire, and on that wire attached to the scales he hung the lead weight.
After the race, on the way to the scales for weight to be declared, Jim Kingsley was accosted by one of the bookmakers and so was delayed for 30 seconds to a minute. When he arrived in the scales, the stewards informed him that there was a major problem and that his horse, Gentleman Jim, had weighed in 29 pounds light. The grafter said, "This can't be right," and stomped up and down next to the scales and said, "I demand you put my jockey back on the scales," which they did, and this time the jockey weighed incorrectly.
The clerk of the scales at Newcastle, he said, "That's funny, those scales don't seem to be, wonder what happened there." So he just moved the scales around a bit and then discovered the little hole bored underneath the flooring board. And then following that up, unfortunately for Grafter, it was found that there was a boy had been hiding under there. They found the weight and the scales, and Grafter, of course, was rubbed out.
The fact that a grafter-like tunnel had earlier been discovered under the scales at Flemington, no less, supports the Banjo-Paterson assertion that race scale fixing was something of an Australian tradition.
They went to scale and, cruel fate, his jockey turned out underweight. Had they tampered with the scale? I cannot tell. I only know they weighed him out all right. I failed to paint this Sydney sportsman's woe. He said the stewards were a crew of low-lived thieves in Dandaloo.
However, in the eyes of both the Melbourne racing establishment and the Wowsers, the lowest thief of all was that bootclicker from Collingwood, John Wren. He was the focus of the racing conflict of the era, a war between religions, social classes, and political persuasions that went to the very heart, not just of racing, but the nature of Australian society. More about money than horses, it centred on the poor boy from Collingwood who had shared the family shame of an elder brother who'd been flogged and jailed for his role in a rape.
I think in a sense you might say that he suffered. You don't have to think hard to imagine what it was like in Collingwood in that depression of the 1890s. It's a pretty drab and dismal place to begin with. And if the way to break out was to make money, then he would make money. And that became, I think, a driving force to perhaps explain most of his life.
At the age of 19, John Wren put every penny he had on Carbine in the 1890 Cup.
It was a real gamble. He stood to lose everything he had, but Carbine won. Now, whether that was God's way of blessing him or the devil's, I don't know. But it was a very fortuitous win because he made a huge pile out of it for somebody in his position, and he decided to keep on with the gambling business.
Wren's illegal tote at 136 Johnson Street, Collingwood, was just one of many such Melbourne establishments. But perhaps its sheer success made it the major battleground. It's claimed that it made Wren £20,000 a year, and an outraged Baptist minister said he counted more than 1,500 punters entering the tote in just 2 hours. A crude microcosm of a TAB operation, it accepted even sixpenny bets. Wren was ever realistic about the financial state of his clients.
The people who ran racing hated John Wren. He was disliked by the hierarchy of the turf of the period, but I'm certain the general public liked him. He was a bit of a hero.
The Melbourne racing establishment railed against Wren. His seedy, illegal, off-course betting shop stole patrons away from their noble tracks. Of course, the extensive betting transactions made in the exclusive gentlemen's clubs were every bit as illegal as those in the Collingwood tote. But there was never any question of the police raiding the Melbourne club. Something they did constantly in Johnson Street. But the laws made convictions difficult, and the tote was increasingly protected by hooded tellers, escape hatches, and the anti-police sentiments of the Collingwood populace.
By the time they arrived in the tote, there was either nobody there, because people had exited through the various escape hatches, or the place had been cleaned up and people were pursuing innocent amusements in the backyard of this operation.
The Bulletin suggested that detectives in charge of investigating vice and corruption could be seen every day of the week, swilling champagne bought for them by Wren. And the prosecutions against J.W. would fail when key witnesses suddenly went walkabout. But for some, the destruction of Wren invoked a higher law. Methodist lay preacher William Henry Judkins, having learned his trade in the temperance movement, was the driving force in a revivalist crusade that gloried in the name of pleasant Sunday afternoon. From Melbourne's Wesley Church, he brought his fire and brimstone to bear on gambling and the Roman Catholic Wren. His sermons were known to make women faint in the aisles.
Steadily but strongly, civic wrongs have been establishing themselves. They have already such a grip of Victoria that retrogression and ruin must come unless we courageously fling them from us. Wren produces nothing, manufactures nothing, does no useful work. He is merely a parasite that thrives on the monumental folly of the community. I will not rest night or day until the Collingwood tote is closed forever.
Truth, a publication whose own fanaticism was on the side of the masses and racing, variously described Juddy as a holy howling humbug and a Bible-banging, pulpit-pounding, penny-pinching, tray-bit-trapping, pharisaical parasite. And for many, on both sides of the debate, the joke was that Wren and Judkins looked so alike that one was sometimes mistaken for the other.
The one crime of which I am accused is that I am a gambler. Well, I am a gambler, and I will remain one as long as I live. And when I look at these non-betters who oppose me, analyse their actions, weigh their words, and see them stripped of their robes of mock sanctity, I feel inclined to be thankful that I am a gambler.
And not just any gambler, but an increasingly wealthy one. From one of the grander mansions in Kew, Wren could now look down on Collingwood and dream the ultimate racing revenge, at least on his tormentors, in the members' stands.
He decided that he was going to put a horse in the Caulfield Cup. And what's more, I'm pretty certain that he had it in mind that he was going to win, because he got the best trainer he could and the best horse and the best jockey that he could.
The thing about the 1904 Caulfield Cup and the betting on it was that it typified what was going on at the Australian racetrack at the time. The biggest owners, the biggest punters and the biggest names were in fact the big bookmakers. You had Oxenham, Sydney's biggest book and most flamboyant bookmaker, Green, Melbourne's biggest and most flamboyant bookmaker at the track, and Wren, Melbourne's biggest and most flamboyant illegal SP bookmaker.
Soon after they turned for home, Sol Green's Gladsome, the favourite, took a narrow lead. Then Humphrey Oxenham's Acracia challenged. Before being beaten by 3 lengths by Wren's Murmur. The Melbourne establishment was forced to watch as the governor presented the cup to Wren.
I'd love to have been there. When you think of all those striped trousers and frock coats and splendid frocks and picture hats and all the rest of it. And this creepy-crawly little runt from Collingwood goes out there and practically spits in the eye of the lot of them. It was his triumph, but they weren't going to let him get away with it.
In 1905, the VRC and the Victorian Amateur Turf Club, without giving any reason, banned Wren's horses from racing. Wren personally confronted the principal club.
I have always acted straightforwardly with regard to my racing, and I think I ought to be given some reason for my entries having been refused, as otherwise my reputation has been injured.
Do you not concur that it is against the interests of the turf for large numbers of persons to congregate on race days in betting shops and bet there continually as at present?
No. I think it educates people to take an interest in racing. My club is not for the well-off few, but for the masses. I do not think gambling is bad. Owing to the conditions of the working man, there is very little for him to live for. Say he lives in a sewer best part of his day. Gambling gives him a chance to get out of it. Makes life worth living. Gives a man hope.
On the streets of Melbourne in the following year, the whisper was that Wren had been responsible for a bomb thrown into the house of the head of the vice squad. Then at Flemington, a bookie, unable to pay his debts, was kicked to death. Judkins redoubled his attacks on Wren.
My friends, this fight is a serious one. It is a struggle not between men, but between good and evil. Parliament is to be the battlefield. Come together in this movement, I beseech you. The call comes to us. God himself is leading us. Rally. Rally. The crisis is coming. The battle is nearing. Strike tents. Call in the outposts. We are closing with the enemy. The shock of battle is upon us. Baggage and impediments to the rear. Cowards and temporizers out of the ranks. All ready. Fix bayonets. Charge. Forward to victory in the name of the Lord God of hosts.
In Victoria's Parliament, establishment and wowser politicians together pressed for a tougher new law that would close the Collingwood tote. Not that Wren was friendless in the chamber. His generosity to politicians of the Labour persuasion ensured he always fought well above his weight. Niall Brennan's father was the Federal Attorney General.
My father asked me to go into Wren's office and collect a donation to his political expenses. And my first impression was of a very large desk with a very small man on one side of it. And he said something non-committal like, "You're Frank's boy, are you?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Wren. Came to collect something." And he flicked a bundle of notes across the desk to me. I was told subsequently that Wren never wrote a cheque, never put his signature to anything, never left any records relating to financial affairs. And this was characteristic. Cash on the nail for Frank Brennan's election expenses.
But Wren's money couldn't prevent the new anti-gaming bill becoming law early in 1907. He closed forever the Collingwood tote. Wren may have been too rich to care by then, but he'd already found other ways to madden the men of mark on the race club committees. He bought his own racetracks at Kensington, Fitzroy and Richmond, and there they raced not aristocratic thoroughbreds, but ponies.
They were universally execrated as places that were unkempt, disorderly. There was no need for any of the primness and finery of the fashionable racecourse. He was getting the working class in again.
Even Edgar Britt, who would later ride for royalty, raced on those downmarket tracks.
Oh, they were pretty tough days, you know. There were some amusing characters amongst them. There was a fellow called old Chris Nelson. I don't know what formula he had, but it was good. He had this horse called Assai. He was a hard puller. He said, don't miss the start. He said, otherwise you'll get killed. You'll never hold him. So I don't know what he'd given him, but he was a hard puller. So I made sure I didn't miss the start, and he led all the way and he won. When he passed the post, I couldn't pull him up. He went round again. And the only reason he pulled up was when he came round the second time, he saw all the other horses waiting to get in the enclosure, and he ran amongst them and stopped. I was only a passenger.
Just as off-course betting had been accused of luring gamblers away from true racing, the crowds at some of the proprietary pony tracks also threatened the mainstream clubs. As Banjo Patterson recorded, they tried to excommunicate all involved.
Come all ye bold trainers, attend to my song. It's a rule of the AJC, you mustn't train ponies, for that's very wrong by the rules of the AJC. You'll have to wear winkers when crossing the street, for fear that a pony you happen to meet. If you see one about, you must beat a retreat. It's a rule of the AJC.
As for Wren, he would outlive William Henry Judkins by more than 40 years. His money, his charity, especially to the Catholic Church, gave him a degree of respectability. Late in his life, he lost a famous criminal libel case against the writer of Power Without Glory, Frank Hardy. And he never won a Melbourne Cup. Amidst all the human egos and the heat of the off-course battles, what happened on the track may have seemed a lesser drama. But there were still great champions. Wakeful, the first lady of the turf, ran unplaced only 3 times in 44 starts. One of her few losses was the 1903 Melbourne Cup.
Why is it that female horses seem to get the tear ducts going more than the male ones? I don't know, but it's often the case. It's this sort of sense of identification of the brave female defeating the odds and beating the men. The people enjoyed that. So she went out into the Melbourne Cup of 1903, and there was this sort of mass desire in the grandstands for Wakeful to win.
Lugging 10 stone, 63.5 kilos, Wakeful is still the heaviest weighted mare ever to run a Melbourne Cup.
Something like 4 furlongs out, she went to the front. It was far too early, and there she was with 10 stone on her back out in front, being urged on by the emotion coming from the grandstands. And of course, out of the pack comes Lord Cardigan with very little on his back at all. And Lord Cardigan gets up in the last stride and beats Wakeful.
Hardened racing men wept. 3 years later, Poseidon, by the same sire as Lord Cardigan, strode out to become the greatest 3-year-old in Australian turf history. In the year the Victorian Parliament voted to close the Collingwood Tote, he won 11 races, including the Melbourne and the Caulfield Cup double.
Very few horses have won such a list of races in such a concentrated time as Poseidon did. He just took the whole racing world on, Sydney and Melbourne in the one season, and he went right through the whole of the major feature races of his time and won the lot.
And not all our champions were horses.
Well, the legacy of the Wootton clan is very important in the Australian turf. The patriarch of the family, Dick Wootton, was a country New South Wales trainer who realised he had a gift for it, took his 2 sons, young Frank and Stanley, to South Africa.
I think they were actually put on horses from the moment they could possibly walk or sit or anything like that. And in fact, my father said they had a pretty miserable childhood because he was my grandfather was quite clear that they were going to be jockeys, both of them, and so from a very tender age they had someone living in the house with them to make sure that they didn't get too heavy, and they were half starved when they were young because they were dying for a decent meal, but it was never allowed because they had to get on the horses and be the jockeys.
Soon after taking the family to South Africa in 1903, Dick Wootton sneaked his eldest son, Frank, out of school to ride his first race on a horse called Centurion. Frank, not then 10 years old, was attempting to become the youngest jockey in official racing history to ride a winner.
All the locals looked at this little tiny fellow and said that he couldn't possibly control a horse or anything like that. But anyway, he won the Goldfields Cup in Johannesburg. The horse was 50 to 1, and I think my grandfather probably made a fortune on him, and my grandmother was furious.
The Wootons then moved to England, where Dick won the 1913 Trainers' Premiership, the only Australian ever to do so. Jockey Frank, still in his teens, won the English Riders' Championship 4 times, and by 1913 had ridden 882 winners.
Unheard of, and certainly as far as the British racing establishment is concerned, is catastrophic in terms of somebody from the Antipodes arriving and taking out one of the most coveted titles in British sport, the Jockeys Championship.
Frank Wooten is almost certainly the youngest jockey ever to be the Premier in England, and he was an Australian from Randwick.
But then Frank Wooten and millions like him were about to be marched away into the greatest carnage of human history. In Australia, it's still the Great War and Gallipoli that many claim made us truly a nation. And whatever our achievements on those distant, blood-soaked battlefields, at home, we weren't about to allow a mere world war to stop us racing. Not only was it good for home front morale, we argued, but the principal race clubs made the slightly dubious claim that the continued racing of thoroughbreds was vital to the breeding of the cavalry mounts we called the Whaler. The futile slaughter of Australians on Gallipoli forced the army to lower its own breeding requirements, so that even jockeys found themselves in the mud of France and Flanders.
He was on the Western Front, on the Somme. He writes in his diaries that, the whole line is aflame, horses are dead. He's living in mud and slush, and in the middle of all this, he writes a little entry, I wonder what won the Epsom.
That was a wistful apprentice jockey, Jack Hutton.
Another entry of his is, what's the loveliest thing in the world? To be riding into the wind on the turn of a racecourse. And another one, to hear the crowd roaring and see the women's parasols and dresses as you come round the turn at Randwick.
Amidst the horrors and the incompetence of the war, Australians often clung to their threatened sanity by doing what they'd always done. Every chance they got, they simply raced their horses and bet on them.
My father actually never spoke much about the war, but he did tell me that when they were in the desert in Syria, that he used to organise race meetings, and they had proper sort of betting and things like that on them just to keep the morale up of the troops. So he continued all the way through with his great love and interest in horses.
Well, racing was very important because it was a chance to let off steam. It was a chance to exercise their horses. It was a chance to fine up the skills they needed. Ability to ride a horse fast was very, very important. Sometimes a matter of life and death. And in the charge at Beersheba, you had them running a Melbourne Cup with an incredible prize at the end of it. The survival of 60,000 odd men and 100,000 animals.
135,926 horses left Australia during the war. When it was over, orders were given that none would come home. They would all be handed to the British or Indian armies, sold to local Arabs, or shot.
Many, many rumours circulated. As far as the men were concerned, the ugliest was that the horses were going to be sold to local Arabs. And they didn't like the way Arabs treated animals.
I don't think I could stand the thought of my old fancy hack just crawling round old Cairo with a jippo on his back, Perhaps some English tourist out in Palestine may find my broken-hearted whaler with a wooden plough behind.
They asked permission to take their horse for a last ride. It was invariably given. And they just came back carrying the saddle and bridle and said, put his foot in a hole and I had to shoot him. Nobody asked questions.
Hundreds of rough, burly Aussies with useless lead rope or bridle in hand stumbled blindly away, sobbing their hearts out.
And the banjo remembered this was not a new experience for Australians or their horses.
Over the seas you brought us, over the leagues of foam, and now we have served you fairly, will you not take us home? Home to the Hunter Valley, to the flats where the lucerne grows, home where the Murrumbidgee runs white with the melted snows. 'Tis only a small thing, surely, will you not give command that the last of the old campaigners return to their native land? And they watched the grim commander, but never a sign he made. Dismiss! And the last of the old campaigners moved off from their last parade.
And lest we forget, some 60,000 Australians died in the Great War. For many of the homecoming survivors, the nightmare would only slowly fade.
The return to Australian life after the war, just to get back to an Australian way of life, inward turning, home-grown Australian culture and life, and the racing was right in the middle of that. And back came the soldiers. They had their deferred pay. They wanted to get back to life as it was. The community were through the war restrictions, and how better to let things go than to go to the races. It was almost like a symbolic gesture about the return of Australian life and peace.
The Roaring Twenties brought a new generation of racegoers to the track and a golden age of racing.
It was really a marvellous experience for a child getting off the trams that were crowded with people. It was like going into fairyland because everybody was sort of happy and laughing. They were all like, it was all like a lot of noise and colour, but to me it was marvellous because when I did get in the stand, I was quite, not many, I don't think there were any other children there, and I was like, oh, you know, you're going to be at the races, and what do you think of it? And I said, oh, it's marvellous. And my father said, oh, yes, but you haven't seen the races yet.
I was only 9 and we went down to see the Cup, and I can remember it as if it was yesterday. It was won by Windbag from Manfred and Pilliwinky, and it was the first big meeting that I'd ever been to, and I just adored it. I just loved it and was thrilled to see the beautiful horse flesh and to see the colours of the jockeys. That I thought I was in fairyland looking at it, and I just loved it.
Time of the year, after the rains, it's all nice grass, and if you didn't get down onto the race course at 10 o'clock in the morning, you wouldn't get a posse underneath these pepper trees, picnic. They'd take the hamper down and spend the day down there. And I think they'll play right around the race course. There'll be people sitting down there with a hamper. and watching the races.
Well, not being a gambler, I never took much notice. I used to go out for somewhere to go with my brother-in-law and my sister, you know, for the sake of wearing a new frock. Because I used to spend all my money. I used to have shoes to match the frocks. Beige colour. It was the frock and a lovely lace coat with a big picture hat and beautiful beige shoes with the red roses on. Oh, they were beautiful shoes.
When you left the course after the races, the trams used to come into the course behind the tote, and you just walk up the bridge and down along the top and down to the trams. And my father called it the Bridge of Sighs. He said, because you listen to everybody saying, oh, I should have backed that. Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that?
Whatever the social reasons that drove us back to the track, it was above all a time blessed with some charismatic horses. Eurythmic and heroic, Windbag, Amunis, Spearfelt, Limerick and Valleycare. There was even an anti-hero ratbag called Manfred. He had a habit of simply refusing to jump at the start. Then, on occasions, he'd finally deign to chase the field, catch it, and still win. Then there was Gloaming. The Victorian-bred but New Zealand-trained bay would have been a hero horse on his own. What made him a superstar were his duels with Beaufort, the Newcastle horse. People who had never been to the track before came to see them run. And it was Gloaming versus Beaufort that brought 92,000 to Randwick in the spring of 22.
Beaufort got a great following from the coalfields in Newcastle down with him when he took on Gloaming. And although he was a gelding, he was the most impressive looking horse. And Beaufort came down like the working man's horse to take on this aristocrat from in the saddling enclosure at Randwick.
And my father said, oh, I think Gloaming's a better horse. Are you sticking to Beaufort? I said, yes. Of course, I don't know whether he ever put it on, but he used to say, I'll put a shilling on it for you, but I never saw the winnings. I don't know whether he did.
Everybody lined that place for it, and it was run helter-skelter from the word go. But Beaufort, he made the pace again. He was a free goer, Beaufort. But it looked, I reckon, Gloaming headed him at the Ledger from where we were. I thought Gloaming sort of had him, but he, Gloaming, I think, more or less just died on his run.
That famous Randwick encounter was their fourth duel and had made the score 2-2. In the Gloaming and Beaufort races, perhaps in so much of the 20s, we're reminded that when the horses, good, bad or magnificent, are more important than the people, then racing is at its best.
There's something about a racehorse. I mean, they're doing their best, even though they've got a monkey up on top to pull him up or anything. The horse himself, he's ready to go, isn't he?
And while romance came riding back to racing, there had been a fundamental change in the Australian relationship with the track. Perhaps the helter-skelter of the 20s hid its full significance. At Randwick, in the spring of 1916, the AJC had opened its new and grand totalisator building. The machine that divides a total pool of betting money amongst winning punters had long been a feature of South Australian and Queensland racing. The new Sydney tote operated in competition with the bookies, who fought its introduction. They found themselves in alliance, holy and unholy, with their old wowser enemy. The anti-gambling brigade claimed the tote would make betting easier and more attractive. But more than anything, it gave governments a taste of things to come.
Through the totalisator, racing became not only approved of by the government, but actually the government became addicted to it. It meant that not only was this question of controlling racing and controlling gambling, but also that there was another player in there who had its hand out and started to want more and more of the action.
Once the Christian soldiers lost their battle against the Randwick tote, they would not again in the 20th century be a serious threat to Australian racing or its gambling godfather. Australians, with a variety of motives and vested interests, had decided they were a nation of gamblers. Racing made that greed of the gain of gold an institution. The Victorian government would resist the siren lure of easy gambling revenue until the early 30s, but would end up as big a junkie as any of them. For us and the world, the roar of the 1920s was soon to be strangled by the worst economic depression in modern history. The same speculative greed and ignorance that had forced the sale of Carbine was about to take its vengeance on every industrialized nation. But then 1929 was also the year in which a clumsy-actioned giant of a horse from over the Tasman managed at his 5th attempt to win a maiden race at Rose Hill. He carried a little of Carbine's blood. His name was Phar Lap. The only certainty in the birth of a thoroughbred foal is that its survival instinct impels it to begin, almost at once, the struggle to stand. That within its first hour of life, those rubbery legs must be ready to run from ancient predators. Whatever the price of its impeccable breeding, unless it ultimately runs fast enough, it may end up as dog meat. But then in the 1930s, half humanity seemed destined for the knacker's yard. Through an era of depression and World War, rich men persisted in paying thousands of pounds in the lottery of bloodstock. Yet ordinary Australians also clung to the hope of the racehorse. With a tenacious humour and a will to survive of their own, they found in the thoroughbred a reason to celebrate. He was just another in the legion of battling, unsung trainers on racing's fringe. He'd spent most of his 51 years around horses with little success. Like they all do, Henry Richard Telford reckoned he knew a bit about breeding. It's how he'd come to have a feeling about Lot 41, a colt at the Trentham Sales in New Zealand. Broke and plagued by second thoughts, he couldn't afford it himself. So he lobbied a hard-nosed American hobby owner, David Davis, to buy him unseen. The big, gangly horse was the cheapest sold that day, just 160 guineas. But when he arrived in Australia, Davis took one look at Phar Lap and wanted no part of the bargain.
The horse was a very angular horse, I believe, as a yearling. And when Mr. Davis saw the horse, he said, "I'm most disappointed, but I'll pay for the horse. But you're going to lease him and you're going to keep him."
Phar Lap's career as a 3-year-old began with 4 unplaced runs. Telford persisted. Knowing his faith in the big-eating but lazy chestnut had fellow trainers laughing at him. And finally, Phar Lap won a maiden race.
Somebody said, "Telford's got a horse in here today, it might be all right." And I said, "Oh, gee, that's that big chestnut that roams around up and down, exercise of an afternoon." And I wouldn't back him. I'd let him go. He won by about half a length, but his next start was a beauty.
The buzz around Phar Lap was building when he went out in the 1929 AJC Derby against the aristocrats, Carradale and Honour. Between them, they'd cost about 27 times as much as he had.
It was in the race, from here to the front, it went that much all the way round. It was odds on. I'd never seen a race like it. For a horse to be that far ahead, I was at the races that day, and that far ahead. I don't think there's ever been another race like it. From here to over there. It's run all the way.
But Phar Lap had arrived in the darkest days of Australian history. The Great Depression filled our roads with ragged armies tramping in search of work. Soup kitchens, squalid canvas camps.
A lot of people too couldn't pay rent, and they finished up living at La Perouse. They built tin sheds out of kerosene cans and anything that they could dig up. Whole families of them just couldn't afford to pay their rent, and the landlord couldn't afford to support them, and out they went.
In the shadow of the northern portal of Sydney's New Harbour Bridge, the Waterhouse family owned the Kirribilli Hotel.
One night everything was normal. Next day it was depression. People were jumping over the bridge, committing suicide. They put up the railing to stop it. Months would pass, 2 months would pass, one shanty would come up, then another. Next thing you know, you'd have a shanty village underneath there.
It's unbelievable. I used to see swagmen, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, waiting for a train to come along. They're hiding in the grass to jump on with their swag and go from one spot in Mackay somewhere else. And the guys that didn't get on, the boys that got on would throw their swags off at the next junction and they'd walk to there and get them, And it was terrible.
Well, Phar Lap was something that came into their life when they needed it. They were suffering from the depression, they were despondent, they were losing hope, and along came this John the Baptist. Brightened their lives up, gave them a new interest.
The public adoration of the horse rubbed off on his immediate connections. Phar Lap's strapper, Aaron Treve Woodcock, was loved equally by the media and the horse. Tommy Woodcock had not initially jumped at the job, but it would make him the most famous ordinary bloke of the 30s and beyond.
He loved him just like your pet dog would. He'd go in the yard and he'd follow him everywhere without him. He didn't have to put a head collar on him or a lead or anything like that. There was a tremendous rapport between them. Just trust and love.
Get the kiss, Bob. Go on. Go on. Good.
The jockey most associated with Phar Lap, James Edward Pike, was then at his brilliant best.
The greatest exponent of hands and hills riding this country's ever known. He rarely pulled the whip. He was beautifully balanced, and he kind of established a different style of riding in that he sat right up on their withers, right up on their shoulders.
The contrasting styles of Pike, Cook and McCartan are plainly seen. Pike's perfect balance has had much to do with his remarkable success as a jockey.
Oh, Jim, especially in a long race, if he ranged up alongside you, he'd have his horse just loping along nicely, sort of not spending a penny, and he'd be right up their neck, and he'd be looking over their head. He had a long neck himself, and he'd be looking over their head like it always reminded me of a swan with his head over their neck, and all of a sudden he'd gradually get you tighter and tighter, and he'd finish up, he'd be laying on you, you'd be sticking your elbow in him, trying to get him to push off you and say, "Keep off me, Jim," and old Jim would just float along there with his old poker face.
Pike, flanked by Davis and Telford, became a newsreel star, even for once pushing Phar Lap and Woodcock into the background.
There's only one chance they've got of beating him, if they can breed him with wings on and get Kingsford Smith to ride him, and then I doubt whether they'll beat him.
Woodcock, a gentle and generous man, would call both Telford and Davis unerringly mean. But Pike, everybody remembered as generous to a fatal fault.
"Don't give anyone nothing," he said. "If they ask you for money," he said, "don't you be involved." And while he's telling me this, a fella came up to him and said, "Oh, Jim," he said, "I'm going bad. I haven't got anything to take home." So old Jim gives him a quid and then turned around to me and says, "See, you shouldn't be doing that."
He was a punter. He was a mad punter. And some of his friends from the 1930s have told me things about him, how crazy he was with gambling.
He'd go to the races, and if he didn't think his horse had any chance, he might look around and see what he thought was the horse that would win it, and probably have as much as £500 on a horse, and then ride the most brilliant race himself and get up and beat it. And personally, I've never seen a betting jockey end up with any money yet.
Just before the 1930 Melbourne Cup, with Phar Lap carrying massive win and doubles money, Pike was made an offer to pull up the horse that many would not have been able to refuse.
A group of Melbourne bookmakers went to Pike and offered him £10,000 in November 1930, when £10,000 would have brought a block of flats at St Kilda or Bondi. And Pike rejected it. He said, "No, I couldn't possibly do it to the owner and the trainer." So that's the sort of man that Jim Pike was.
Woodcock was offered £4,000 to nobble him, Telford £10,000 to scratch him. They all held firm. 4 days before the Cup, someone tried to kill the horse. Tommy Woodcock put himself and the pony he was riding between Phar Lap and the shotgun, fired without effect from the villain's car. Telford sent the Red Terror into hiding at St Albans Stud in Geelong. Woodcock slept in the stable with him. On the morning of the Cup, a police escort took them both to Flemington. And perhaps the greatest jockey never to win a Melbourne Cup was riding at Flemington that day.
On the day of the race, all the traffic and everything, he was rather late getting back, and Phar Lap still hadn't arrived in the paddock, and they were just about to go out when Harry Telford got him saddled up and got him in the paddock.
Of over 300 nominations, 15 starters breast the barrier. All the way to a good start, and the struggle for the Melbourne Cup begins.
The 1930 Melbourne Cup was the centrepiece of Phar Lap's Australian career. Despite the depression, a crowd of 72,000 came to Flemington. Another 40,000 who couldn't find the admission price watched from Scotchman's Hill across the river.
Everyone's eyes was glued to the one horse. And when they turned for home, he just rode up to them, shot to the front, and won literally in the canter.
Phar Lap is increasing his lead with little effort and proves himself one of our greatest stayers in winning the classic event by 3 lengths ahead of second Wind, who is finishing strongly, and Shadow King 3/4 of a length away. The slow motion camera shows the finish in detail. Oh, what beautiful action.
Despite actually losing more Melbourne Cups than he won, the champion now needed a wider world in which to prove himself.
Now you can all say goodbye to the conqueror. Like Christopher Columbus, he's going to discover America. Let's hope he's as successful as Chris was. Good luck, Phar Lap. Australia's with you. I'll say we are. Goodbye, old man. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Davis decided he would run in the $50,000 Agua Caliente handicap in Mexico, the richest race in the world.
They're off in a good line, but Phar Lap is cut off by the outside horses, and he commences to drop back. Coming down past the stands, Cabizo is just leading, and Phar Lap has dropped back to the rear of the field. He is out wide and keeping clear of the other horses. When they settle down, Cabizo just leads Marine, Scimitar, and Good and Hot. Phar Lap is still well back, with Elliot taking no chances of interference. They're going towards the turn now, out of the straight, and Cabizo is still leading, with Phar Lap out wide and a long way back.
And surely he'd been run too wide. He was carrying the top weight. The extra distance he was covering, 3 and 4 horses wide, must take its toll over the mile and a quarter.
And Good and Hot. Phar Lap is commencing to move up. He's running 7th now. Spanish.
But then he lengthened stride. Moving round the bulk of the field, he seemed to want that win as much as Australia did.
Phar Lap, they're racing neck and neck now. He's got him. No, Phar Lap's strides are commencing to tell. He's coming away from the Valley Boy with only a short distance to go. Elliot is riding very hard, but Phar Lap's got it. Come on, Phar Lap, you beauty.
A flood of offers for a major American campaign beckoned the big train from the Antipodes. But 16 days after the Mexican triumph, Phar Lap was dead. On an April Tuesday in 1932, he died near San Francisco, hemorrhaging over a distraught Tommy Woodcock.
I don't think that Tommy Woodcock was ever the same after. He died in his arms. He had his head cradled in his lap. But I think that all Australia wept when Phar Lap died.
He died over there, the same thing as our boxers. Got poisoned over there too. See, a lot of our champions, Americans have been jealous, I think.
A perfect example of the taxidermist art has restored Phar Lap, so that for all time the world will retain a faithful impression of the great racehorse. But the fire and sparkle...
We'll probably never know what or who killed him, but conspiracy theories still linger. In 1933, Edgar Britt sailed to race in America.
As the champion returns to Sydney, boxed and crated, a still and silent figure.
I remember one old lady, one dear old duck, she was standing on the dock and she was always looking over the rails at everyone and quite fascinated with everything. And this old girl was shouting out to me, "Edgar, you look after yourself. Be careful of those Yanks," he said. "They killed Les Darcy and they poisoned Phar Lap." He said, "You be careful. You look after yourself, son."
Harry Telford trained on until his death without another major success. As an old man, the lovable Tommy Woodcock would, as the trainer of another rough champion, Reckless, find himself once more in the limelight. 4 years after Phar Lap's death, Jimmy Pike was forced to retire at the age of 43.
Well, Jim, you rode your first winner for me 30 years ago, and you also rode your last winner for me the other day. And I wish you all the luck in the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelso.
And that goes for me too, Jim.
And thank you, Mr. Paulson.
In failing health, he tried training unsuccessfully, spending and gambling away his wealth. He died in poverty, having lost his last job as a Bondi barman because, the story goes, he couldn't deal with the changeover to decimal currency. In the year Phar Lap died, 500,000 Australians were out of work. Whatever the social cost, British bankers and our conservative politicians insisted we keep up our debt repayments. We needed another Phar Lap.
Meet His Majesty Peter Pan at home at his Sydney stable. When Peter won the Jubilee Cup at Randwick, he set the seal upon his racing fame.
Peter Pan, I was only very small, but I still recall him. He was a beautiful chestnut horse with a silver mane and tail. And he was a great racehorse.
Look for that peculiar mannerism by which racing men know him. He tilts his head to one side as if listening for the welcoming roar of the crowd. Here he comes again, a flying machine at any distance from 6 furlongs to 2 miles. But there's no pride in Peter. He's as meek as a lamb as he takes a mouthful of grass from his trainer, Frank McGrath.
Bred near Singleton, Peter Pan was trained by Frank McGrath, a trainer who'd learnt about horses on the working-class pony tracks.
There's no question that he was wrapped, absolutely wrapped in Peter Pan. There's no question about that.
I was there late in 1931, and going around the stalls, he said, there's the next year's cup winner, which was Peter Pan. Well, he was right.
Ridden by Billy Duncan, he went out as the 4-1 favourite in the 1932 Cup. At about the 5 furlong mark in a bunched field, Peter Pan struck interference and appeared to go down.
At the 6 furlongs, the race is on in earnest. It was at this point that Peter Pan met with interference. He is moving up on the inside of Manafanua. He's got it! Look at Peter Pan go back onto Dennis Boy. Oh, bad luck. It looks as though the favourite is out of the race.
My father actually saw the horse disappear, saw him fall. He was absolutely convinced beyond any doubt that Peter Pan had fell. And he put his glasses down and with shock and emotion.
Perhaps time has improved the story, but it seems that Peter Pan's stablemate, Dennis Boy, struck him and knocked him back on his feet.
I was listening to Eric Welch, and then, of course, when Peter Pan made the charge, oh, brother, hell broke loose. I'm riding harder than Billy Duncan.
Uramba wins it all right. He's coming away from Peter Pan, who's finishing on a bit strongly. Now Peter Pan might get there. It's going to Peter Pan will win it. Peter Pan will win it. Peter Pan wins from Uramba with Shadow King third.
He won with a grass stain on his nose, suggesting he'd kissed the turf. And then, in 1934, Peter Pan became the only horse since Archer to win 2 Melbourne Cups.
My father, right to the finish, he was strongly of the opinion you couldn't shift him, that Peter Pan was a better horse than Phar Lap.
Have you seen Phar Lap?
No, but I'd like to.
By Jove, Neville, he's a great horse.
What makes a great horse? Breeding or training?
Both. Oh, what a horse. If he could only cook. The Red Terror, the greatest horse in the world. Here he is in action again.
In the time of both horses, newsreels and the wireless were changing the Australian public's relationship with the track. People now had an involvement, almost a sense of personal ownership, in their heroes, the horses. Big, ugly wooden cabinets became objects of worship.
I grew up in a racing family in Stanthorpe, and I didn't particularly appreciate that because a Saturday afternoon was a no-noise afternoon. You couldn't talk too much when the radio was on and races were on. You couldn't talk on Saturday morning when scratchings were being taken.
Well, especially in North Queensland, there would have only been half a dozen wirelesses, as everyone called them, on the Atherton Tablelands. And of course, one of the wirelesses was owned by Slasher Davies, the local barber in the pub. And I recall the men crowding around the wireless, 10 deep, with their ear down almost on the ground. It stood on the ground, on the floor, the radio. It was a big STC, or it might have been a radiola, one or the other.
Very often the reception over the Blue Mountains was bad, and so you would very often have blokes putting their heads right down into the bottom of these old radio sets that were standing on the corner of the room, through the crackle and the static, trying to hear the broadcast, and then someone would jump up and say, "He's won!" And nobody quite knew who it was.
Oro the centre, and over on the outside is Cavero. Brontalk now takes over, drew 3 in front. Oro second, the outside.
The race clubs argued that the wireless was keeping punters away. they tried to force the listeners back onto their tracks. Race callers were banned from the course. So, through the early 30s, a largish, ruddy-faced man, lugging broadcasting equipment, could be seen climbing into the Moreton Bay Figs, overlooking Warwick Farm. Or parking a truck alongside Rose Hill, putting a table on the truck tray, then a chair on the table, and finally, perching himself on the precarious pyramid to call the race for listeners of 2UW. He was one of Australia's first great race callers, Cyril Angles.
A furlong to go, it's Bronzehawk still in front. Bartle, he's found something. Bronzehawk, he drew a length clear of Cavera again. Oro into third, but Bronzehawk's going to win the 1934 Rosehill Guineas. A length on the line. Second in Cavera, third.
And perhaps the best-loved caller of them all was Ken Howard.
Monte Carlo first, Burnfield second, Harnham Hill first. Monte Carlo failed to break the bank, but he made an awful dent in Bookie's bag.
He told me that he once called a race meeting above a Victorian provincial racecourse from a hydrogen balloon. Now, I would never have thought Ken was brave enough to call a race from a hydrogen balloon, but he swears it was true.
Thank you very much, John. This is Ken Howard, privileged to bring you the broadcast of the great race.
I remember at Canterbury Park, the story goes that Ken Howard broadcast from a house with a fowl yard at the back, and it was quite a proliferation of chooks, and when it became race time, Ken's offsider, always armed with a good packet of wheat, would feed the wheat to the chooks to keep them quiet during Ken's call of the race.
The clubs took their battle against radio to the Supreme Court and lost. So by the time 3XY's Harry Solomons prepared to call the last race from Ascot in Melbourne in the late 30s, there could be 3 or 4 stations broadcasting. Solomons, deep in gambling debt, had planned the great phantom race call swindle.
Just before the race was about to start, suddenly all the other race callers' microphones went dead, and their lines had been cut back to their radio stations. What in fact happened was that Harry Solomons had arranged for some cohorts to cut the radio lines of all the other callers.
With the race actually over, Solomons pretended there was a hold-up at the start, while letting his co-conspirators know the winner.
Scott the Berkeley welter, and the reason is buoyancy. Buoyancy is played up very badly at the start, a very, very poor exhibition. Patience is a virtue, and...
All over the country, they piled on the money for Scopey Breasley's mount, knowing it had already won.
They're just about ready.
And he said this horse Buoyancy's playing up, and he kept on talking about buoyancy. Then he'd broadcast the race.
Buoyancy puts the head in front, starting to run home.
Some 3 minutes after the race had finished, Solomons called it from memory and imagination. Unsuspecting bookmakers everywhere were duly fleeced.
Well, I didn't know anything about what was going on, you know, and I went on buoyancy, and let's face it, we didn't know anything about it until probably the next day, you know.
We were working in the ledger, my father, and they just, unfortunately for him, the race we were listening to, they'd cut it off just when they said they're off.
Even without the alert of the single strangled call of "they're off," it's unlikely that Solomons could ever have got away with it. He went to prison, never ratting on all the others who must have been involved.
He got the whole job pretty right to a point, but he was found out at the psychological moment, you might say, and finished up doing time over in the end. I think they picked him up in Fiji from memory.
To many of us, it was hardly a scandal. Not only were all bookmakers considered fair game, but the majority of Australian punters were criminals, betting illegally.
We had this vision of the radio broadcasters being sort of some quixotic souls who were prepared to climb trees and poles and people's fences because of some sublime desire to call the races. But let's have a look at who was actually benefiting from this. It's the SP bookmakers.
The SP, the starting price bookmaker, paid out according to the prices being quoted on course when the race jumped. But the making or the taking of a bet anywhere outside a racetrack was illegal. Punter and bookie deemed equally criminal.
starting price lives and grows like a cancer, sapping the spending and saving power of the people who need protection from the bloodsuckers who rob them of a few shillings.
It represented, by far and on a massive scale, civil disobedience unthought of in any other area of Australian society. Every second and third household, every Saturday afternoon, was breaking the law. They were having a bet with the local SP bookmaker, and it permeated from Bernborough to Kalgoorlie to Cairns to Hobart.
See, I came from an industrial town, and in the Depression years and past that, those towns were very deprived places. There was very little, particularly for, say, women. There was no entertainment, no clubs, very little opportunity for life. So to have a bit of a bet of a Saturday was just some extra interest or additive to life.
Well, it was the poor man's way of betting. You bet with the milkman, you bet with the bread carter. You bet with the ice man, who used to bring the blocks of ice round. There was no refrigerators.
My father went into a partnership with his uncle, who was the SP bookmaker in Stanthorpe. It was a part of the country town that I grew up in. Certainly on a Saturday morning there were hundreds of people who would come to the shop to have a bet.
Well, my father ran the SP business from the back of the billiard room, a little room at the back with a telephone and a chart and 2 assistants. And it was so well set that, see, my Auntie Biddy was living in a lane in Portland, and she had a little book which she had about 12 clients, and they were women betting in sixpences and shillings.
We couldn't complain. See, he was working down at the wharf, but then there'd be only odd days to do it, and then we start doing the SP. Well, sometimes we'd stand up, we didn't tell the punters, stand up with no money, and I'd have me rent for Monday morning. All luck. I was pretty lucky, and so was my husband. We had the barber shop for a blind. Well, then we got a man to come that was a barber. We had to cut all the equipment and everything we had to buy, and we had that. Well, he'd come in. Well, then the people would come in and Reg would go around and pick up the bets. Sometimes if he wasn't there, well, the barber would take a few and give them to Reg.
There was about 25 of us in the class. A boys' night, say at least 15 of us had a job connected to an SP, all in around that era. And it was, you know, we all used to boast. How did your bloke go? Oh, I brought a fortune back from mine. How'd you go? Oh, well, he's won plenty. You know, you'd all have to compare notes. Everyone was telling lies, of course, because if they'd count up how much we'd have won, there must have been the richest people living around the South Sydney area. They all had plenty.
My father used to get a little note down from Mother to Paul at the convent to ask him, "Dear Mr. Ryan, would you put a shilling on a winner for me?" You know, and that went into the convent, helping the convent go.
Even the bookmakers, they had licence at SP. They were a very big place in town, you know, big SP bookmakers. Because my brother-in-law used to get good commission.
Some clients only go to Randwick. And if they're working the races at Warwick Farm or Canterbury, they wouldn't go. They'd usually ring up your office. And that's where we started betting SP. And we bet SP and bet you'd hold a lot more money betting off the track than what you'd hold on the track.
The tic-tac men sent the SPs their lifeblood information from betting rings at the track. With no access to the jealously guarded on-course telephones, they communicated the betting fluctuations with their arcane semaphore. If they were caught at it, they were thrown off the course.
Spawley. Here's the numbers, mate. 5-1.
In the cause of keeping the phone lines clear, bringing the far-flung SP network the on-course betting fluctuations, Even the lady operators of the Post and Telegraph were drawn into the web of our national corruption.
It was all done from the Sydney end. Supposing the race was on at 2 o'clock, at 20 to 2, a call would come through to the exchange at Portland. The telephonist, who was also getting a little stipend, of course, for her Saturday afternoon work, she would then just connect that Sydney line to the billiard room.
Hello? Ed? Can you hear me?
It wasn't like a big deal, but it was a small deal. But the wife, but the terrible part was if we had visitors, people used to say, "Doesn't your husband get a lot of phone calls?" And she used to say, "Oh yes, he's people ring him up and talk about nothing." But he said he doesn't talk for too long, does he? He said no. It was rather had a humorous side, but it was a bit unnerving. We hoped nobody ever called of a Saturday afternoon.
In fact, the police made regular raids on SPs and their clients. It was, after all, a reliable way of supplementing their depression incomes.
Very bad for your nerves, and then you never know when the police are coming down. Sometimes you have to sling them.
All the police were being paid, Sergeant, the Constable, the Inspector in Lithgow, Division 21 men when they came up. Everyone was getting paid to keep the system going, keep it quiet. But the Inspector at Lithgow had let him know that they were coming in Saturday afternoon, about 2:30.
SP's wages of sin paid for young John Ryan's education at a Bathurst boarding school, and even, by association, provided the transport.
The car who came to collect me was Sergeant Purdon, the local police sergeant. And my father had arranged that with him to come up and take me to Bathurst, which I did. So their relationship was reasonably close, you might gather. And he wasn't likely to come round and knock on the door and say, "Mick, I've got a warrant for your arrest here."
We got the drum, the police were coming down, and it was race day because they wouldn't come the other day. So I closed the front door and I got fancy work. And I'm standing at the front, all the boys over the Umi, they said, "Listen, Rose, the coppers are here today, be prepared." So I'm sitting out there doing the fancy work, so he's over the road and I'm waiting for him to come. So I'm standing there. He says, "We know what you're doing." I said, "Gee, you'd be blind if you didn't." I said, "I'm doing fancy work, do you like it?" He says, "Aye, we know you're doing SP." Well, I said, "Why, what, do you want to bet?" He got real nasty. Anyway, he said, "I'll catch you yet, though." I said, "Be a good man if you can catch me." He walked off.
Whatever it did to our national morality, such pragmatism about betting on horses in the 30s was perhaps an essential survival mechanism. Betting illegally was a gesture of defiance, and however false, horses and the next race are about hope. For most young jockeys of the time, that hope was driven by a certain desperation. It's the toughest of all racing jobs, but it's often the only chance a lot of small blokes will ever have for fame or fortune. Even if it demanded that their place in the pecking order began a little lower than the average cattle dog.
I fluked a job with a man called Maury Hennessy, little old man. So he put me on, and he says, "Can you ride?" I said, "I've been riding since I was 6 going to school." Good, so he said to the other boys, "Get the Brumby out and see if he can ride." So he got there and I jumped on it, and he said, "How'd you go and jump it over that hurdle down there?" Because the Brumby was taut, he just went boom, stopped dead, and I went bang over the fence. And he said, "You can't ride at all, and now I'll teach you," which he did.
Being brought up in the bush, I rode mustering, and I rode to the steers in the show, you know what I mean? And I was a horse. I was part of a horse, you know, that sort of thing. I knew all about horses and animals.
I hunted around the stables and finally found a job with a fellow called Kelpie Smith, and he gave me a job, but there was no pay attached. It was a kind of work for nothing or don't work at all. So that's what happened. He had no bedroom for me. He had an apprentice. So I was only the worker, and two of us slept under the house. We had our single beds under the house, and it was cold too, at times.
They didn't have your modern cons. In those days they only had the old briquette heater, and she used them to turn out hot water that quick, you know. So there's me and another bloke at the stables, and your bath night was Friday night, once a week. So you'd have a bloody, flip the coin to see who got first tog of the bath. The second one, she was cold.
I'd won the Moonee Valley Gold Cup on this horse, Uramba, and Darcy Eccles, the owner, came into the jockey's room and gave me a big £100 note. It was a great big blue note that had sheep all on it, and I'm looking at this note thinking, oh, that's pretty good, and my boss come along and took it out of my hand and said, you're too young to handle that money. So I said, well, boss, I've rode the winner of the cup and I want to go to the pictures tonight and take my mates out. He said, I'm expected to shout for them. So he gave me £5 bob. I said, this will only pay my fare in. So after a bit of pressurising, I got a quid out of him. So I was able to take the boys out and shout them a milkshake.
For the jockey, racing is a much more dangerous sport than boxing or motor racing. On the track, death and injury ride on the shoulders of even the best of them. The thoroughbred horse is an unpredictable beast. It takes fright, takes charge, tries to jump the running rail, or suddenly head for home. At full gallop in a bunched field, its legs can snap, its lungs can fill with blood, and some of them are simply evil.
Well, I broke my leg in 6 places one time. And then I broke it a second time. A horse kicked me at the barrier the second time. And broke a clavicle, broken nose, had concussion. But apart from that, I broke both wrists once. That was awkward. Running around with both wrists in the air. But apart from that, I was pretty lucky.
I rode this horse at Canterbury and he jumped the outside fence and he broke my pelvis, he broke my collarbone, he broke 3 fingers, crushed my chest, and I was out. I was in a coma I went into a coma on the Sunday and I never came out of it till Wednesday.
Jack Thompson, who would keep riding until he was 62, lost count of his falls.
I think I've seen the inside of every hospital in Sydney. If there was a fall, we would just all pile in the car and sit there in the hospital and see how he was. So it's you'd take along your book and you'd sit in the casualty room and see how your father was.
Seen them killed, run into rails, hit posts, killed in track work. Yes, I have. But it's never really worried me. I get up and get on, because if I was to let it worry me, I probably would have been finished 20 years ago.
In the Jimmy Pike era alone, at least 120 jockeys died in riding accidents. Most of these deaths were barely reported. Those we chose to mourn, perhaps too slowly, making their dangerous occupation a little safer. From Tommy Corrigan in the 1890s, Keith Voitra and Billy Lappin, Neville Selwood and Leanne Goodwin. And John Tapp was there the day Ken Russell died.
I didn't realise that the horse's pelvis had shattered. He was still on his feet, falling rapidly back through the field, and horses were ducking and diving in all directions to miss him. Ken Russell, being the horseman that he was, stayed with him. He was literally trying to ride that horse to the ground, as great horsemen do. But just before Twig literally sunk to the track, a horse coming from behind, which was just couldn't get out of the way, ploughed into Ken Russell and flung him to the ground with tremendous force.
The carnage of the 20s and 30s brought an improved skull cap and better training of apprentices. In or out of the saddle, the Great Depression had made us great survivors. Individually and collectively, the experience left its scars. A careful, conservative generation. And even as we began to believe that happier days might indeed be here again, we were given the ultimate lesson in the dangers of smiling too soon. On Friday, September 1, 1939, Poland was invaded by the Germans, and by Sunday we were at war, following Britain without a moment's debate.
When I went in the army, you know, I was 7 stone or something like that. I don't know what that is in kilos today. They passed your medical fit and they gave you something to go and get your clothes. And my clothes, what they had, well, they wouldn't fit. They were just like, the pants were about 8 inches, 10 inches too long. The coat was hanging down around the knees and all this sort of thing. And they sent me finally, and I think they done it to Selwood and all the others, we had to go to a special tailor and have them made.
Jockey Eric Parnham was also forced to face the reality of his stature, as under fire he prepared to land on the Borneo coast.
We're going into Borneo out of a Liberty ship into amphibious jeeps. So I had this dirty big pack on, heavier than what I was. And I undone the clip, you see. So a big sergeant or WO or whatever he was said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What am I doing?" I said, "Now listen, if this sinks," I said, "I'm going to sink right to the bottom with it because I couldn't hold this and walk, swim anywhere." I said, "But if I haven't got it on my back, I've got some hope of swimming." "Oh, all right, don't worry." So I didn't do it up, and of course, in we come, in the land, and all these Japs are in trees shooting. I said, "Jesus Christ, this is the end of the world." Oh, Christ, I was frightened, I tell you.
Jim Osborne was at El Alamein with the Australian 9th Division. With him were 2 brothers who'd been convinced that a young horse they owned would not amount to much. So before they enlisted, they'd sold Colonus.
Well, it took 11 days, and then we were pulled out overnight, just about properly buggered. And 2 wonderful blokes were on my gun. Dennis and Jim Robbie were there, and we were taken back to about 25 miles. The next morning a breakfast came up, it was a stew. But they also brought a wireless up. And we listened to this news, that the good news, the break had been achieved at El Alamein. And then they gave us the Melbourne Cup.
Making a fast run into 3rd place. Colonus skips over the heavy ground to lead Phocion and Heart's Desire in the last dash for the
The Robbie brothers listened as Colonus, the horse they'd once owned, distanced the 42 Cup field.
Melbourne Cup history. It's the easiest Cup win in 80 years as Colonus finishes the job with 7 lengths to spare.
Listening to the Melbourne Cup gave them a boost. Actually, at the time it was run, fatigue was all we really felt. And this suddenly gave us a real lift. The adrenaline started squirting again. But it's one of those things you can never forget. You just had the worst part of hell that most of us had ever been into. And you come back and It's great news.
Somebody yelled 6 to 4 the field in far-off Palestine, and it acted like the call to arms on 15,000 Aussies. The boys soon discovered that other books are written in the Holy Land besides the Book of Hebrews. That's what brought Anderson out of his shelter. The tote lacked a few gadgets, but not customers.
In the Middle East, our troops actually managed to race, but in every theatre of war, we gambled. So much so that the battalion SP seemed like a commissioned military rank, which on a good day paid more than the colonel got.
We had a little old wireless, Australia, Radio Australia. You could just hear it. So this colonel or whatever he was come down. What's going on? We're giving the soldiers a bet. They're having a day off. And he says, you can't hear that thing. So all of a sudden he got us a big powerful wireless from engineers or somewhere. He got it anyhow, so we stuck it up. You could hear it all over the island nearly. And of course, geez, we had some people betting.
And as they move along to the furlong and a half post series was well clear.
Anyhow, we had a great day. We ended up winning £600. I said, geez, it is a day.
Sirius has been ridden for dear life to stall off Peter's challenge. Sirius is holding Peter at bay. It's going to be a battle right to the post, but Munro looks like having it. And Munro on Sirius beats Peter to the post.
In the meantime, there's a war on. The film must be rushed to troops in forward areas.
The fact that the 44 Cup was won by Sirius and Darby Munro seemed almost incidental to the military operation of getting film of the race to the troops.
To be shown by Army amenities at 8 o'clock Sunday night at Darwin, Moresby Ley and the most remote Australian battle station. Let's hope they'll be able to see the next one in civvies. But here it is, as the troops saw and heard it, the 1944 Melbourne Cup.
But for thousands of Australians, there would be no cheery newsreels. In prison camps like Singapore's Changi, those who still lived were brutalised and starving. Yet even here, some refused to have their memories broken. In the prison camp of Chiang Kai, Australians heartbreakingly honoured that first Tuesday in November. Those who were strong enough piggybacked those that weren't. They lined up with their living skeletons of jockeys, and they bloody raced their Melbourne Cup. In Australia, abandoned by Churchill, we welcomed the American, General Douglas MacArthur, to our undefended shores. A man used to having his way, he wanted Prime Minister John Curtin to ban racing. Curtin refused. And the crowds that filled our wartime tracks must have made the American Caesar wonder who the hell we were.
The 6th Wartime Melbourne Cup, 84th of the series, magnet for all Australians despite travel priorities. Businessmen have sudden urgent appointments in Melbourne. MPs are there, they're everywhere.
I'd never seen so many people. I mean, I was a kid from the bush, and there must have been 50,000 people there. It was absolutely packed, and I saw all these fellas that I thought that I'd read about in the Referee and the Sporting Globe, and all of a sudden I was looking at them. I thought they were saints. Darby Munro and Ted McMenamin and Ted Bartle and Andy Knox and Jack Thompson, Billy Cook. They were all there, right before my eyes, and I thought I was made.
Fantastic money pours into bookies' bags. 3-1 to field, 3-1, but try and get it. It's fruit for the sideboard.
In the depths of war, racing still allowed for dreams. His ambition fueled by hard times, a young Bill Waterhouse had begun to call the odds.
we had a ball out there, but you experiment when you're young. You got no fear. I remember I'd open up in the paddock, I'd open up the market, and as I say, people would charge at times, and it was a lot of fun, and you get very good at it.
And the most successful battler that racing ever knew was persisting with a pig of a horse that even a saint would have given up on. A bloke forged in easier times might have walked away, but not Thomas John Smith, nor a young jockey who shared the dream.
I was on the train, and when I got to Wagga or wherever the border was, TJ got on with 2 horses. And that night we were sleeping in the hay, and he was telling me about he was going to be the leading trainer one day, and I was going to be his jockey. And I'm lying here and I'm thinking, this bloke, either I'm cuckoo or he is, because I hadn't had a winner, and he had 2 horses, but he kept at it.
Nine o'clock, Wednesday morning, August the 15th, 1945, and it's peace. Peace at last. And Sydney
The
goes
peace
wild
that now
with
broke out would be followed by another golden age of racing.
with tumultuous thousands. They came to work, but now they're out to celebrate. Perfect strangers kiss perfect strangers.
In time, 2 of its giants, T.J. Smith and Bill Waterhouse, would find themselves related by the marriage of their children.
It's wonderful.
And in one of those bittersweet coincidences, the young man dancing in a Sydney street to celebrate the peace would play his part 40 years on in the battle to save half the dynasty. For the dancing man is Frank McClary, later QC, and one of the Waterhouse lawyers in what we would come to call the Fine Cotton Affair.